In the punctuation video, I talked about clauses and how we can connect them with stop punctuation, half stop punctuation, and go punctuation. In this video, I'll specifically talk about the half stop punctuation, which contains colons and dashes, and the go punctuation, which contains comma. Let's first begin by talking about their uses before I move on to examples and various other questions. Let's start with our beloved comma first. The first and the most typical use of a comma is to separate items in a list. For example, we have this sentence. The museum's new open storage display brings some 900 vintage World's Fair souvenirs out of attics, desk drawers, shoe boxes, and museum archives for visitors to view. Now we have got items and you can easily separate them by using commas. Please remember, whenever you have a list, a comma is always preferred before the word and. Secondly, there should be no comma after the word and. Please remember this rule. The second use of comma is after closing parenthesis where it would normally be necessary. Context matters a lot, please remember that. For example, the Tower of London was constructed as a prison in the 11th century, 1078 to be exact, comma, but over the centuries, it has been used as everything from an armory to a treasury. We've got two independent clauses here. We need a pause after closing the parenthesis, and the best pause in this scenario is a comma. It is also serving as a fan voice conjunction to connect two independent clauses. The third use of comma is after introductory words or phrases. Remember the transition words we have talked about earlier? Like at first, nevertheless, on the other hand, for example, for instance, however. All these words, sometimes they appear as introductory words or phrases. They start a clause or a sentence. If they do, they must be preceded by a comma. The fourth use of comma is to separate non-essential clauses. We have also talked about this earlier. For example, Messi, who plays for Barcelona, is a better player than Ronaldo. Sorry Ronaldo fans, I am a huge Messi fan, hence this example. In this sentence, who plays for Barcelona is a non-essential clause. Hence, it should come in between two commas or two dashes. The next use of comma is before fan voice conjunctions. Whenever you are joining two independent clauses with fan voice conjunctions, they must be preceded by a comma. For example, we have already talked about this example earlier as well. London is an old city, comma, but it has many modern buildings. We have got two independent clauses. We are joining them with a conjunction, fan voice conjunction. It must be preceded by a comma. If it is not preceded by a comma, it's a mistake. It's called a run-on sentence. Lastly, you can put a comma when you are introducing a quote. For example, David whined, comma, I am famished. You can also write the sentence like this. I am famished, comma, whined David. Now let's talk about colons and dashes, which fall under the half stop punctuation category, which states that they must be preceded by an independent clause or a complete idea. That remains there. I won't be touching upon that. My purpose in this video is to compare colon and dashes and tell you which one to prefer in certain cases. Whenever you have a list or names or titles, a colon is preferred. Please remember this. Let's have a look at this example. Photographer and filmmaker George Picker chronicled artists such as including colon, folk singers, jazz musicians, and visual artists. We have a list. A colon is preferred before the list. But this sentence is wrong. There's a purpose I've included this sentence. If you have a list, it should not be preceded by a transition word. You can either use a transition word or a colon. You cannot use both. The correct version is photographer and filmmaker chronicled a wide variety of artists, folk singers, jazz musicians, and visual artists. This is the correct version. The second use of colons and dashes is before explanations. For example, the Amazon parrot does not make an ideal pet for most people because It requires much more affection and attention than many other animals do. Again, this example is wrong because you cannot use a transition word and a punctuation together. The right version should be, the Amazon parrot does not make an ideal pet for most people for one major reason. After that, we have an explanation. It requires much more attention and affection than many other animals do. In this sentence, I cannot take sides. Both colons and dashes are correct. You will not get both of them in the answer choices, so you don't have to worry. Next use of colon is between titles and subtitles. For example, finding your dream home, colon, a buyer's guide. You don't use a dash here. Lastly, colons are used between hours and minutes. I think that's pretty obvious. You say that it's 2 a.m., you use a colon and not a dash. Talking about dashes, they are used to separate non-essential clauses. We have already discussed this earlier. For example, London, which is a very old city, has many new modern buildings. Now you separate the non-essential clause with 2 dashes or 2 commas as well. Lastly, dashes are also used to create a deliberate pause. This is a very rare use of dash, but you must be familiar with it. For example, after 8 hours of driving, we finally arrived home. Dash. And that was when we discovered that we had forgotten to close all the windows. Now that you're familiar with the various uses of commas, colons and dashes, it is not possible that we do not apply them on various questions and examples. Let's dive into the details.
Let's start with this example. Wrangell St. Elias National Park, the largest national park in the United States, represents everything compelling about Alaska. It is immense, larger in fact than Belgium. Although this is not underlined, but I still want to discuss this. It is immense and we have a dash here. And you see after that, she's basically explaining how immense it is. Larger in fact than Belgium. That is the reason we have a dash over here. After basically when you have an explanation, when you want to explain a point, you can put a dash. It showcases towering mountains dash. Mount St. Elias stands over 18,000 feet tall as well as glaciers. Now, if you read the entire sentence in one flow, you will see that there's something wrong. It's not making sense. We have one dash here, that's a clue. And the hint is that you might have a non-essential clause over here. And that is something we need to look for. So it showcases towering mountains as well as glaciers. This sentence is making sense. So if I cut out this clause, something that we've already talked about earlier, you will see that the rest of the sentence makes sense. It showcases towering mountains as well as glaciers. So this is basically extra information that we have. And you know, whenever you have extra information, that is basically non-essential. And it must come in between 2 commas or 2 dashes. We already have a dash here, so we need to put a dash over here. That is the correct version. So A is definitely wrong. In B, we have a dash. In C, it's a comma, that's wrong. And in D, we have a semicolon, that's also wrong. So the answer is option choice B. Next question now. Alaska's human history is also displayed in the mining towns of McCarthy and Kennecott. Just getting there is an adventure. It's a long day's drive through miles of wilderness to reach the park's entrance. I always tell my students, never look at the option choices first. Evaluate the question yourself and then see what fits over here or what's the correct version of it. So just getting there is an adventure. We have a colon here. It's a long day's drive through miles of wilderness. So you see, you can say that this expression after colon is basically an explanation of the previous clause. That is, just getting there is an adventure. Now, what kind of adventure is this? It is basically a long day's drive through miles of wilderness to reach the park's entrance. So it makes perfect sense. And that is why option choice A is correct. But we'll still have a look at the other options as well. Just getting there is an adventure, semicolon, it being a long day's drive. This is definitely wrong. You see, the structure is wrong. And I've already talked about this. Being, this verb is not liked by the SAT examiners. So whenever you have this word anywhere in the option choices, you should be skeptical about it. Always remember. Just getting there is an adventure, but it's a long day's drive. No, it's not opposite. We don't need a fanboys conjunction over here, and especially but. Why? Because it's not opposing. We are basically explaining this point. We are not opposing or contradicting this point. That's why option choice C is also wrong. Adventure, it's a long day's drive. We have got two independent clauses. A full stop might work, but this is wrong. It's a long day's drive. We need an apostrophe over here. It is basically, it is a long day's drive. So we need an apostrophe over here. That is why option choice D is also wrong. So we are left with option choice A. Next question. A dentist's job includes tasks such as filling cavities, examining x-rays, and applying protective sealant. Same mistake that we have talked about earlier. We have a transition word plus we have a colon as well. You don't need both because both serve the same purpose. Either use this or use this. So a dentist's job includes tasks such as filling cavities. Let's have a look at the option choices. Okay, A is definitely wrong. Such as filling cavities, no, this is definitely wrong. We don't need a semicolon. We don't have two independent clauses like this. Such as filling cavities, examining x-rays, yes, this makes perfect sense. You have got this transition word, and after that you don't need a colon. So our answer is definitely option choice C. Let's move on to the next one. Dentists who receive medical training similar to that of doctors can also perform oral surgery on patients and write prescriptions. Now your hint is this subject, and we have a comma immediately after the subject. And after that, we also have a W word that gives you a huge hint that we are trying to introduce a non-essential clause. And if you have a non-essential clause, you know the drill. Cut out the non-essential clause and then join the rest of the sentence and see whether it makes sense or not. Dentists can also perform oral surgery on patients and write prescriptions. Definitely, this is perfectly fine. And now over here, you have got a dash. You've got a comma over here and it's not underlined. That means it is correct. So over here, we need to have consistency, and that is why we need to have a comma over here. That is there in option choice B. That's our answer. Next example. The northern snakehead is a fish that lives up to its name. We have a colon. Its head tapers to a point, making it look as if someone, perhaps a mad scientist, had grafted a snake's head and several inches of scaly body onto a fish. Whenever you come across punctuation marks, always underline them and try to understand what is happening. That's very important. Be skeptical about these punctuation marks. Okay, let's read this sentence again. The northern snakehead is a fish that lives up to its name, colon, and then we basically have an explanation of the previous clause. And you know, if you have an explanation, a colon is basically preceded before an explanation. So it's perfectly fine. And I always tell you to not look at the option choices first. Evaluate the sentence first and then move on to the option choices. Now, let's have a look at these. So A can be correct, but let's have a look at option choice B. Name, we have a full stop. Its head tapers to a point. This can be correct as well. But we've already talked about this rule that these clauses are basically connected together. They have a strong connection. I haven't completed my point over here. So why should we have a very strong pause like a full stop? So that's a mistake. Name, its head tapers to a point, and then we have a semicolon. This is definitely wrong because the next clause is not an independent clause. Name, its head tapers to a point. This is a typo as well over here, but we should definitely have some sort of punctuation over here. Option choice D is also wrong. So we are left with option choice A, and that is the best scenario that we have. Next question. I'll read from this point again. Its head tapers to a point, making it look as if someone, perhaps a mad scientist, had grafted a snake's head and several inches of scaly body onto a fish. Now this dash over here is a clue. We have a dash over here, but we have a comma over here. And you know, if you've got a non-essential clause, it must come in between two commas or two dashes. But first evaluate whether it is non-essential or not. So its head tapers to a point, making it look as if someone, let's cut out this clause, as if someone had grafted a snake's head and several inches of scaly body onto a fish. It makes perfect sense. So this is definitely extra information. And if it is extra, it is non-essential. And if it is non-essential, it needs to come in between two commas or two dashes. So this dash is not underlined, hence we should have a dash over here as well and not a comma. And that is there in option choice D. Last question. Its fins hang unevenly from its body as though they were tacked on as an afterthought. Given the fish's wild appearance, it's hardly a surprise that scientists have given it a nickname, Frankenfish. Interesting? So we have an independent clause over here, and after that we have this name. Okay, so far I don't see any mistake over here. This can be used, but now let's have a look at the option choices. Okay, we'll put a question mark here. B says nickname Frankenfish. This is definitely wrong because we need to have some sort of punctuation over here. In C, we have got colon Frankenfish. Okay, this is very interesting. Let's put a question mark here as well. And then we have nickname semicolon Frankenfish. This is also wrong because Frankenfish is not an independent clause, and semicolon is basically used to join two independent clauses. So you can easily eliminate option choice B and D. Now the issue over here is colons and dashes, they both fall in half stop punctuation. And half stop punctuation basically states that they must be preceded by an independent clause. And this clause is basically independent. So that means both colon and dashes are correct in this scenario. And yes, they are correct. But over here, a small issue, a small point that you need to remember is whenever you have got names or whenever you have got a list, we have already talked about the list, they must be preceded by a colon. It's a very important point. Please remember the preference must be given to colon if you've got name or a list. So in this scenario, our answer is basically option choice C.